everybody, and thank you for joining us for the new session of EMKAN Futures Podcast. EMKAN Future Podcast is aiming to increase the knowledge or spread the knowledge about future-related topics by hosting distinguished guests in different fields, futurists, practitioners in foresight, horizon scanning, scenario planning, and in other fields, social, technological, and etc. Today we have a well-known futurist and researcher, Dr. Patrick Noack. Dr. Patrick Noack is the Executive Director for Futures and Imagination at Dubai Future Foundation. Welcome, Patrick, to the show.
Pleasure to be here, Modifier.
Patrick, I will start and dig deep into the matter and asking some future-related question right away without any introductions. So in 10, 20 years, how do you see the future?
Oh, I should have prepared for that question. Look, let me just give it a little bit of thought here. This sounds almost like an interview question, but it's one of those things, right? There are so many things happening right now, and people have a sense that change is accelerating, that we live in a time when so many realities collide, come together, vie for position, and the question really is, what will emerge from that? There are a lot of people who will claim that change has always been with us, and even the rate of change is not much greater right now. Of course, with the pandemic, we seem to focus on that a lot. But I think going forward, there are some very deep and structural things and developments that are likely to shape the way we're going to function. Ultimately, I think the coronavirus pandemic is going to be something that we as a species collectively will be able to deal with in one way or another. I think Dubai is an interesting and important example of how that pandemic is being addressed and how we live with it and how we function with it, which is very different to what other countries are doing in terms of very strict and severe lockdowns. But I think more broadly, we need to examine how we are moving from, let's say, the fourth industrial revolution to the next chapter of industrial progress. Mm-hmm. I think, and here I'm referring to some of the work we did at the Royal Society, and that's about brain-computer interfaces, or how we connect machines to our brains and thoughts. Right now, we speak through a computer, and we have to still tap keys, and that rate of communicating or sharing information, certainly the tapping key parts, is very, very slow. Mm-hmm. So that's in the order of kilobytes. But if you can imagine that one day we will be connecting through devices that don't have to be drilled into our heads, but can just be much like an earplug or an earphone, pick up signals from our brains and allow us to communicate wirelessly and digitally across great distances through the right kinds of technologies and machines, I think we are going to witness a new kind of interaction, a new kind of development of economies, new business models emerging, and I think important ways for people to share information, to share knowledge, and to grow. We're still, I think, a pretty long way from that, but that's the in my mind, that's the fifth industrial revolution. We are going to feel that the way we have been communicating over the past year via Zoom is going to feel very archaic, simply because one of the things that we miss now in a conversation over Zoom is that connection with the person. Even though we see people, we don't connect as people. Yeah. And if we're able to connect on a cerebral, on an emotional level through devices that are going to make that interaction incredibly lifelike and hopefully, possibly very, very rewarding, anything is possible. You started off your question, what will life look like in the future? I think it's very hard to make predictions because if you want to make a prediction and you want to be right, you're going to be conservative, and life is going to be less conservative than we imagine it to be. So it's a very difficult question. But I think some of the technologies that will come online will help us become much more dynamic, interconnected, and effective compared to what we are today. There's a few things, a few wrinkles that need to be ironed out, of course, along the way. We want to make sure that people don't steal our thoughts, that we continue to own our thoughts, etc., etc. But this is one possibility going forward. There's plenty more.
Yeah, of course. No one can predict the future, as we all know. And I will come back to the neural interface, what you are mentioning about, the neural interface. I have some question about that. But let me go back to the COVID-19 and what we are experiencing now. One of your articles, you described us as we are like in a horse-like levitation. Although it's like more than a year now, but we are still into that, movement. And I want your perspective, Patrick, about, how important when you think about the future to have an end result in mind in order, make it easier for you to accept the change that is happening and embracing it and being more excited about it.
I think it's incredibly important. And it's important because we want to make sure that we individually and collectively have something to look forward to, something to achieve, something to aim for. So the analogy that I described in that horse-like levitation is if you're filming a horse, or if you take a photograph of a running horse, there's going to be a moment where that horse is not touching the ground and is just suspended in midair.
Right.
And if you just see that photograph, you don't really know what's happening, because you don't see the movement, you don't see the starting point, and you don't see the end point. Mm-hmm. Now, in a horse race, that's the analogy I'm making. In the horse race, the starting point is clear, and the goal, the end point, is clear as well. Right. And what's interesting about the race is that change, right? Is mm-hmm. how one horse is jostling for position vis-a-vis another. And the reason that the change is so appealing and interesting is because we have the end goal firmly and clearly in our minds. Now, with COVID, I think we've been collectively very focused on the here and now, and so on the levitation almost. Mm-hmm. We are still levitating. We're not at a point yet where we know exactly where we want to be, or where we need to be, or even where we might be, because I think, and this is very much a personal view, it's certainly not an institutional view, we are not that great as a species right now to assess what is happening in the way we live and what it means for when we come out of it. Let me explain. We're now all working on Zoom. Our children are working on Zoom, learning on Zoom. They have been doing so for the best part of a year. Of course, in Dubai, less so. In other countries, a year. Yeah. And we're not really thinking about what it means for their growth, for their cognitive development, for their ability to function as individuals in a society, and how they will relate to one another. Yeah. Same is true in a whole host of topics, and we're applying these plasters and band-aids to make sure that a solution that functions now does its job for now, but we're not thinking of the long term. So that's, I think, because we haven't really got a clear perspective of what we think the future should look like, above and beyond some of the limitations that we're going to face. So if we have a better idea, a better understanding of how we will depict that future collectively, how we want to deal with remote working, deal with educational realities, deal with professional realities, deal with social realities, deal with gender realities. And, we saw there's ample evidence how the pandemic and the new working arrangements are affecting women and men differently, people in different socioeconomic environments very, very differently. If we're not grappling with this and saying what we want the solutions or the future to be, then we're just going to be that levitating horse, not really knowing where we're going, because there is no clear end state in mind.
Yeah. And From that bit, what do you think, the role of a futurist or something, or someone who's like working in the field of future thinking in dealing with this challenge? How we can like help people thinking long term rather than short term as a futurist, of course.
Yes, I think it's a very challenging role, even though the pandemic right now has, and I'm sure many of your guests on this podcast have spoken to this previously, that the pandemic has now brought the profession of futurist into sharp focus, and there's now attention to what people are saying. I think what's important is a number of things. One is that it's, we can't predict the future. It's not that we have some kind of a special tool that allows us to tell the future. And I think also it's important to shy away from predicting the future. But I think the important thing is, and my sort of professional background is developing scenarios, and one of the key points of developing scenarios is to identify a range of plausible possible futures. And there's always going to be a range of very diverse kinds of plausible futures. And the important thing in that is that it allows you to be ready now. It allows you to start identifying signals that point towards different kinds of futures. So, for example, if we think of the future of our lives in Dubai or in any city or country around the world, there's not just going to be one future, because everyone pushes for their own version of the future. And some of those futures might be compatible and others might be incompatible. But at least once we know that there are some compatible and incompatible futures out there, then we can say, well, what do I want my own future to look like, and how can I achieve it in a world that is going to be promoting and allowing me to achieve my own future? But perhaps more importantly, what do I need to do in a world where it's going to be difficult to achieve my own future, because other futures are going to be contrasting? So it's really about understanding that there's a range of possible futures. And I think futurists have a responsibility to make that clear, to make it clear to people, to users, to anyone who's going to engage with those scenarios or with those kinds of visions of the future, to understand that there isn't just one future, like there isn't one present either, right? We all have our own view of how the present displays itself and manifests itself, and what it means and where it will ultimately take us. And because there is that diversity of understanding of the present, there will be a diversity of futures. Now, the other thing I just wanted to add as well, and this is a little bit of a hobby horse of mine, is that when you develop scenarios and visions about the future, and you develop 2 or 3 or 4 different ones, there's a very strong desire or almost tendency of some to say, well, of those 4 different futures, I prefer, number 1, the first future there, that looks really appealing, I'm going to go for that. It's not so much about identifying which of the futures that you've developed and you've told people that are plausible. So it's not a matter of just identifying the one that you prefer. You need to be able to work with all of the futures. You need to be able to understand all of the futures to then say, as I said earlier, how can I achieve my own version of the future in any of the possible futures? So the important thing is not to fall into the trap of just picking the favorite one.
Yeah. Actually, I want also to link what you are describing here, Patrick, to the work you have been doing with the Future Foundation and the various reports you issued about the future of mobility, future of cities, and etc. How you translated what you had just described into those reports, and what were your objectives in releasing those reports?
So we developed with Dubai Future Foundation 13, 15 or 18, I can't remember, reports on the impact of the coronavirus pandemic as it was developing on different kinds of sectors. Now, I think it was relatively early days, and we were developing some research, I think starting in April 2020, to provide a little bit of a guidance and to provide additional insight onto how some of the sectors or some of the realities we were living might be evolving into different kinds of directions and different kinds of futures, depending on the impact that we were anticipating the pandemic could have on those areas. So the objective really was to provide people with an analysis of what we felt at the time was going to happen to a particular sector. And there, of course, I think one of the early ones was on education. Everyone was experiencing the fact that children had to learn from home, and
I think education and the future of workplace, those were
future of workplace, exactly. Yeah. Those were the two immediate impacts that people felt across Dubai and also more broadly across the world. And so we were trying to provide some insight as to what it might mean over the medium to long term, and also some recommendations as to what ought to be done in terms of practices, investments and opportunities. Mm-hmm. So those, I would say, were more research pieces than significant foresight pieces, but they were aimed at providing a snapshot of where we felt a particular sector was going. Mm-hmm. And I think they were really well received, because we were able to collaborate with a number of different entities and different organizations within Dubai, and provide some information to the population at large. So I hope they have the intended effect.
I think it did, and actually one of the initiatives or achievements of UAE in the recent months was a probe mission to Mars, and I think this relates to your participation in the World Government Summit. I think it was a couple of weeks ago, or a panel, especially with Michael D. Tyson.
Neil deGrasse Tyson and Martin Rees. Yes.
Yeah. So you spoke about, the exploration of Mars, but I want to hear your perspective about two competing views about, exploitation of other planets or Mars in specific. One saying we should stick on Earth and solve the problems on Earth, then we can make life on settlements on Mars. And the other one is saying, no, we can, go to Mars, and the development technology that part of this mission could be utilized in solving problems on Earth. What's your stance on this?
Well, look, I'm not an astrophysicist. I think in any case, and this is true since people have raised their heads and looked to the stars, there is that fascination, that appeal towards, what's out there. Right. Increasingly, we know more about space, we know more about planets, we know more about the universe around us, and so that is an incredibly strong appeal. Now, recent history has shown us as well that countries, and this I think is something that Neil deGrasse mentioned in that World Government Summit segment, that countries that have engaged in space exploration have seen a significant uptake of science technology subjects, so STEM subjects, by the population, by the local population. And so with the UAE's Mars mission, that is, I think, a very important and very tangible outcome as well, that I think we've observed in the UAE more and more youngsters being attracted by science, technology, engineering, and mathematics subjects because of that appeal of going to space, going to Mars, etc. Now, the other thing I think that we need to be mindful of is that we have been able to send some probes to Mars, around Mars, and onto the surface of Mars. We've sent probes into deep space, and we've stepped onto the moon, but there's still a very big gap between what we've achieved now and what needs to be achieved in order to be able to settle a colony on Mars, for example. Yeah. Some calculations say that the kind of rocket power that we have now to lift materials off the surface of the Earth and into space toward Mars is a fraction of the percentage of what is needed to actually settle on Mars. So we still need to develop a fair bit of technology in order to get us to where we would like to be, if that is our objective. But I think at the same time, if we have the technology that enables us to lift thousands of times what we currently can lift to get to Mars, we may also develop the technology to try to address some of the current challenges that we face. I think also that it's not so much just a technological challenge that we're facing with climate change, with biodiversity reduction, by all of the challenges that we face right now, but it's really about economic issues and political decisions that need to be taken. And that's why I think some countries that are at the forefront of this really will become leaders going forward. And the time to take that leading position is now. I mean, it's really now or never. We seem to be living at a point in time where those decisions need to be taken to prevent any further damage that might be irreversible for the planet as we know it. So I think, and I'm not the only or the first one to say this, that an escape to Mars or to another planet, to the detriment of this planet, might be a questionable allocation of resources and time and energy and funds, and so we could be doing so much more to safeguard what we have on this planet and everyone on it, and I think that's the key point: everyone on it. That it would really warrant some significant investment and time to get that right.
Yeah. I want to touch, Patrick, also on a common idea in your articles. Also, it's about questioning our assumptions and questioning our worldviews. Being worked in the UK, and I think you have experience in living other places, and now working and living in Dubai, and you are exposed to both cultures. How do you see culture affecting our worldviews, and what do you think we can get out of it, or how we can utilize the culture as a mean or a drive to think about the future?
I think it's absolutely critical and central to any kind of thought that needs to go into the future, and it's also one of the very appealing parts of thinking about the future. It's as I said, I've lived in various places and I've worked in many more, and that's always been incredibly fascinating and important in trying to get anyone to think about the future, because with different cultures come just different viewpoints and come different realities. We spoke earlier about the different understanding of the present, and different cultures, different individuals view the present in very, very different ways. So the cultural and the social aspects absolutely shape the way we think. And if we don't realize that, we will have missed the trick. So what I'm trying to say is that it's very easy for us to engage in confirmation bias. In other words, to seek out information that confirms what we think or believe. Yeah. It's we see it every day by going to the same news outlets, by going to talk to the same people, by going to the same meetings and fora, and engaging with people and with views that give us the confidence that what we believe and what we think we know is true. And it's only by going and seeking out different kinds of cultures, and by cultures, it's in the broadest sense. It's only by seeking out different kinds of cultures that we can develop new insights, that we can be made aware of new ways of approaching the present day and new ways of thinking about the future. Yeah. If we try to develop scenarios, if we try to think about the future by being very, very narrow, we will be hit by surprises, and that is absolutely unquestionable. So there's a few quotes that I always like. One is, of course, William Gibson, which you will know, and which many of listeners or people who are engaged in this work will know as well. Which is so William Gibson is a science fiction writer, And one of the quotes that's attributed to him is, the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. And what that means is that I have very, very limited information about today and the coming days and weeks and years in the future. But if I speak to other people who have different views, they might have a piece of information that's important for me to understand where we might be headed. There's another interesting quote, which is attributed to, I can't remember who, that says, it's not what you don't know that will get you, that will surprise you, but it's the things that you thought you knew for sure, but just are not so. So in other words, it's you think you know certain things, but if they're not the way they are, those are the things that will surprise you.
This is the biggest surprise.
And so it's really about opening up to uncertainty. So opening up to different cultures means opening up to uncertainties, letting go of that comfort that the apparent knowledge will provide you with. And I think from that point of view, uncertainty can actually be quite a reassuring thing. So you accept the fact that we don't know everything. There's more out there to know. And by opening up to those new points of view, you actually increase your understanding and your knowledge of the world.
Yeah, actually, this is like a quite interesting point, and I remember one of the past episodes we discussed with one of the guests about the role of a futurist is being like one to help people, organizations, whatever your like participant or audience in on dealing with this kind of ignorance, because we spoke about what you just described is kind of ignorance. If you think something in a certain way and you believe it is true that what you're thinking about, and the reality it's the opposite or it's different. This is kind of like of ignorance. And by engaging more participants, by taking different perspectives, you are like you are defying that ignorance. So I think, and what you have relate to uncertainty is also crucial in the matter of fact that business as usual is not always the best way to think about the future. And maybe this is the difference between like strategic planning and the future thinking, where we assume at strategic planning this like business as usual is like it will remain, we are generating power and electricity, so this is our business as usual, and after 10 years it will remain the same. But rather than future thinking, we cannot even claim that. I want here, Patrick, to move to another subject before we wrap up, which is the neural interfaces and your work with the Royal Society. And if you can reflect on the work, I think it was like 2019, the report issued, or 18?
I think it was 2019. Yeah.
2019.
Yeah, it must have been 2019.
So how, if you want to reflect back on this work 2 years back, anything change, your perspective change due to the COVID-19, to the accelerated digitization that we experienced, to newly like technology advancement? Anything change in that?
So I firmly stand behind that piece of work because it was, I think it was a very, very good and solid piece of work, which was developed by supporting a number of leading scientists in this field, in the field of neural interface technologies. And also it is one of those very interesting areas in that when we think about brain-computer interfaces or neural interface technologies, we think of very cutting edge. We hear about Elon Musk and his Neuralink, or we hear about Kernel and Brian Johnson, or we hear about Facebook developing their neural interfaces. So it's tech companies, cutting edge and all that. But the reality is that some of the early neural interfaces, certainly the technological ones, date back to the 1960s. And these are hearing cochlear implants. So for very deaf people, cochlear implants were developed that would amplify an external sound and transmit that to the relevant regions in the brain. And so the reason I'm saying this is because that there's a real continuum in terms of science and technology that might lead us, that is likely to lead us in the direction that I've mentioned earlier about where neural interfaces could be in the decades to come. So there are very strong trends in that direction, and those trends are about miniaturization. So things become smaller and smaller. Yeah. We saw, Neuralink having been able to develop tools that are still implantable, so they have to be inserted into the brain through the skull, but they become really, really small and manageable. We see new tools being developed to study the brain, and those tools were not available 10 or even 7 years ago. And with those new tools, we gain a deeper understanding of how the brain works, or we gain a better understanding of how to deploy technologies in regions of the brain that we want to impact. So in other words, there's a movement, I think, that we've observed from a wholesale of an attempt of a wholesale understanding of how the brain works, to instead say, what do I want to achieve in the brain? Do I have the tool to achieve that? And where is the best place in the brain to influence, to communicate? And so I think the approaches have changed to an extent, but the technology is absolutely relentless. It just keeps on going. And I think we will see incredible advances in the years and decades to come. Now, there's a couple of things that need to be added here is, what are the drivers behind this? So it's not so much, one of the drivers, for example, for one of the tech companies that have a Siri-like application is that they found that people feel a little bit self-conscious about saying, hey, Siri, where's the nearest barber, when they stand on the underground in London, right? They get a little bit self-conscious. So one of the tech companies is trying to develop typing by thinking technology. That's not going to be, that might be an interesting thing. It's not going to be a major driver, but some of the major drivers behind the development of those technologies are the gaming industry. So gaming is developing at a rapid pace to integrate brain-computer interfaces with virtual and augmented reality. For that, AI and machine learning are absolutely critical. And for that, then the devices that allow us to extract, to close the loop between providing information to the brain and extracting information for the brain, those technologies will increasingly accelerate. Now, the other thing that I think is important is that medical applications, much like we talked about cochlear implants earlier, and also Parkinson's disease treatment, obesity, and other illnesses that people face currently, they will also be addressed with neural interfaces. So there's going to be a very big medical applications market, but the biggest push, absolutely the biggest push, is going to come from gaming, with then adaptations towards other applications.
Nice. And I can imagine how this will impact the pharmaceutical industry as well. So now, instead of treating a disease with like a pill or something, you can take a device or an implant to deal with that.
That's absolutely true. And one of the big areas that's developing as a consequence, and not just in the brain, I think, is also electroceuticals. So how can we stimulate through electrical targeted and modulated electrical impulses specific areas of the brain and of the body to deliver a medical benefit. So it's definitely an evolving area and the space to be watched.
Amazing. And actually, I want to mention that this is also an area for debate, where the ethical perspective of it, like where shall we stop? Is this like an open space? We can like deal with any kind of capability of implants or like neural interfaces. For example, if I am like wealthy, I can have some implants to enhance my brain capacity or memory or anything like that. And where shall we stop? I think this is an open debate yet, and it's not like something we reach to a common understanding about.
I think you're absolutely right, and it's true in neural interfaces, and it's true in a number of other areas. So the aspect of policy recommendation and regulation is central to anything that's to do with emerging technologies or new kinds of technologies. And the balance that needs to be achieved is that you want to make sure that innovation is allowed to continue. So you need to have regulation that allows that, but regulation that's not so stringent as to inhibit innovation, and at the same time protecting the user. So how do we protect users? How do we protect the future user? You know, that's where foresight is going to be very important. So how do we protect our future selves and our future generations from possible detrimental effects of technologies or other things that we don't know yet about? And at the same time promote that kind of innovation. So we've got a number of projects at the BioFuture Foundation where we develop pilots together with the private sector and implementers and regulators to make sure that recommendations are relevant and that they're able to be part of the landscape of the future with the right kind of almost anticipatory regulation to achieve the balance of safety and innovation.
Amazing. And I think this is part of Dubai being at the forefront of legislations and policies related to future topics and areas of development. One last question, Patrick, and it's about, you have been like doing work with Dubai Future Foundation. I'm not sure if you have experience before that in the region, but what is your like top or most important advice you can give to futurists or people in this region? They are like now trying to get into the future related domain and work as a futurist. What can you advise them from your experience and from what you know about the region as well?
Okay, look, I think this region starts with a very significant advantage, and that is that it's you don't need to convince anyone that it's important to think about the future. And it might sound strange, but there are places around the world where maybe not so much now because of COVID and other challenges, but a few years ago where things were going well, no one really needed to think about the future because they will continue to go well. Now that is of course not the case, and it's a very risky position to take. So as I say, the advantage in the region here is that you don't need to convince anyone that it's important to think about the future. So that's number one. That's a great thing. I think the second thing that's really important is to make sure that for anyone who really wants to become a futurist and to work in futures, is to just pluck up the courage and do it. So get education, get educated, get the relevant education, information, knowledge, but then make sure that that gets translated into very practical approaches. Just be practical. There's a lot of reading out there. There's a lot of great online resources, but the key is at one point to just jump in and develop a scenario building process. And the first one will be not so great. The second will be a little bit better. And the third one will be even better. And it just grows from there. The key is to just assess how each of those activities went. How can you improve it? How can you grow it? How can you make sure that, and I think that's a really important point, is how can you make sure that it is applied and used? One of the risks is that people get carried away in developing foresight processes or scenarios, but that they don't get applied, they don't get used. And that's a separate set of skills, is to make sure that people who need to hear those scenarios and who need to understand them actually have access to them and engage with them. But with practice that comes, the key is it's a very open environment here in Dubai. The key is do it. Just jump in and do it. Take the courses and then do it.
Amazing. Amazing. And actually, I think it's very, very true. And from my humble experience, that no matter how you read, how many courses you got or theoretical background, unless you get your hand dirty and, do the actual work, engage with people, identify the different perspective, different views, biases, and how you can encompass it and work within this environment, is you will not gain the experience and the understanding for this. Patrick, thank you very much for this interesting conversation. Any last words you want to have at the end of this show?
Look, we've spoken about so many different topics. I think it's been it has been rewarding for me. I've enjoyed the conversation with you, Mudaffar, and I hope it's been helpful to your listeners. So it's been lovely to be on the show. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And for you, our audience, we will be posting some of the links about the topics we discussed, about the neural interfaces, the work of Patrick with the Royal Society, Patrick's links and contact info if you want to reach out to him and carry on with the discussion. Thank you, Patrick, again, and hopefully we'll see you soon in Dubai.
Nice to see you. Pleasure.